The gentle hum of the jet engines filled the luxurious first-class cabin. John Carter adjusted his crisp navy blazer, glancing sideways at his wife, Angela, who was scrolling through her tablet. Her expression was focused, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping lightly on the screen as she reviewed her notes for the conference ahead. Angela always exuded elegance, her presence commanding respect. But even in a sea of privilege, the Carters' presence seemed to spark something uncomfortable in certain people. John leaned closer. "Are you sure you want to rework that section?" "It's already strong," he said, his baritone voice warm. Angela smiled faintly, her diamond earrings catching the cabin lights. "I'm sure. I need the data on community reinvestment to be airtight." Their whispered conversation was interrupted by a loud, purposeful clearing of the throat. Cindy, the flight attendant assigned to their section, stood at the edge of the aisle with an icy smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. "Is there something I can help you with?" Angela blinked, surprised. "No, thank you. We're fine," she replied politely. Cindy lingered, her gaze flicking to John, then back to Angela, as if searching for something to criticize. "Just making sure," she said, a faint edge to her voice. As she walked away, Angela exchanged a glance with John. "What was that about?" she murmured. John shrugged, his jaw tightening. "Let it go. Maybe she's having a bad day." But Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Cindy's demeanor wasn't just rudeness, it was something deeper. The first crack in the facade came an hour later, during the pre-meal service. Cindy returned, pushing the cart with exaggerated force, her movements jerky. She stopped abruptly at the Carters' row. "Beef or vegetarian?" she asked, her tone devoid of the warmth she used when speaking to the other passengers. "I'll have the vegetarian," Angela said. "And for you?" Cindy asked John, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Beef, please," he said calmly, sensing the tension but refusing to acknowledge it outwardly. Cindy handed over the trays with a little too much force, causing John's drink to wobble precariously. He caught it just in time, glancing up at her with a measured look. "Careful," he said evenly, his tone calm but firm. "Apologies," Cindy replied, though her tone suggested she didn't mean it at all. Angela leaned toward her husband after Cindy moved on. "Did you see that? She's being deliberately rude." John nodded subtly. "I noticed. Just stay composed. We've dealt with worse." But it was easier said than done. The breaking point came midway through the flight. Angela, feeling a chill from the air conditioning, pressed the call button for assistance. Cindy appeared moments later, her face tight with irritation. "Yes?" Cindy asked, her tone laced with impatience. "Hi," Angela began, her voice as gracious as ever. "Would it be possible to get a blanket? It's a bit cold." Cindy's lips curled into a tight smile. "Blankets are available for all passengers in first class. You should have seen them at boarding," she said pointedly. Angela frowned, taken aback by the unnecessary hostility. "I understand, but I didn't grab one earlier. Could you bring me one, please?" Cindy let out a sharp breath, her hands gripping her notepad tightly. "I'll check, but next time, try to be more prepared," she said, the condescension dripping from her words. Angela's jaw tightened, but she refused to let her composure crack. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice cool. When Cindy returned, it wasn't with a blanket. Instead, she leaned in close, her face hovering inches from Angela's. "You people are always so entitled," she hissed under her breath, low enough that only Angela could hear. Angela's heart pounded, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but controlled. Before Cindy could respond, John stepped in. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. His eyes locked onto Cindy's, unblinking. Cindy straightened, clearly caught off guard by John's quiet strength. "No problem at all," she said, her voice now saccharine. "I'll be back with your blanket." The humiliation didn't stop there. When dessert was served, Cindy forgot to offer them any options. When Angela politely reminded her, Cindy sighed theatrically and muttered something about being high maintenance. Several passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly noticing the disparity in treatment. Angela tried to brush it off, but the humiliation was beginning to wear on her. "Why does she think she can treat us this way?" she whispered to John. "Because people like her assume we don't belong here," John replied quietly. "But she picked the wrong people to mess with." Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. "We need to document everything," she said, pulling out her phone discreetly to take notes. The final straw came during the beverage service. Angela asked for a cup of tea, her voice polite as always. Cindy returned with the cup, but placed it on the tray table with so much force that some of the hot liquid sloshed over the rim, narrowly missing Angela's hand. Angela gasped, pulling her hand back instinctively. "Careful," she said, her voice finally betraying her frustration. Cindy smirked, leaning down so only Angela and John could hear. "If you can't handle a little spill, maybe you're not cut out for first class," she said venomously. The words hit like a slap. But before Angela could respond, Cindy did the unthinkable. As Angela reached for a napkin to clean the spill, Cindy swatted her hand away, the back of her own hand making contact with Angela's face. The cabin went silent. Angela froze, her mind reeling. The slap hadn't been hard, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. Every pair of eyes in the cabin was on them now. John stood slowly, his towering frame commanding attention. "What did you just do?" he asked Cindy, his voice deadly calm. Cindy opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She glanced around, suddenly realizing the gravity of what she'd done. "Apologize," John said, his voice still eerily calm, but laced with steel. I didn't mean," Cindy stammered. John held up a hand, silencing her. "Save it. You've already done enough." He turned to Angela, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "Are you okay?" Angela nodded slowly, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. "I'm fine," she said quietly, but her eyes told a different story. John turned to the other passengers. "You all saw that," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin. "We're not letting this slide." Several passengers nodded, murmuring their support. One man even spoke up. "I'll be your witness." That was completely out of line. Angela, regaining her composure, pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of Cindy, her hand steady despite the turmoil inside her. "This isn't over," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who is used to fighting battles and winning them. As Cindy backed away, flustered and pale, John leaned over to Angela. "Call our team. Let's make sure this flight is Cindy's last." Angela nodded, her expression set. She won't get away with this. The remainder of the flight was cloaked in an unbearable tension. Cindy had retreated to the galley, her forced smile replaced with a nervous, almost panicked expression as she whispered to the other flight attendants. They avoided the Carters entirely, as if proximity might implicate them in the incident. Angela sat with her back straight, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through her phone. She wasn't usually one to show vulnerability, but the slap, a deliberate, degrading act, had cracked something deep inside her. I can't believe she thought she could do that," Angela whispered, her voice low but filled with emotion. John placed a steadying hand on hers. "She thought she could because she's been allowed to," he replied evenly, his tone sharp with meaning. "But not this time. Not with us." Angela looked at him, her eyes misting slightly. "It wasn't just the slap, John. It was everything leading up to it. The way she looked at us. The way she spoke to us. Like we didn't belong here." "She made a mistake," John said, his voice calm but resolute. "And now she's going to learn what happens when you underestimate the wrong people." Angela exhaled slowly, steeling herself. "I've already emailed Rachel," she said, referring to their chief legal counsel. "She's looping in the rest of the team. By the time we land, they'll be ready." John nodded approvingly. "Good. Now we need to start gathering as much evidence as possible." Angela glanced around the cabin. A few passengers were still casting furtive glances in their direction, clearly uneasy about what they'd witnessed. Angela leaned in closer to John, lowering her voice. "We need to get witnesses on record," she said, quietly, before anyone has a chance to spin the narrative. I'll handle it, John replied, already rising to his feet. He adjusted his blazer, his expression calm and professional, as if he were about to step into a boardroom instead of confronting strangers in the aftermath of a public humiliation. John approached the man who had spoken up earlier, a middle-aged passenger seated 2 rows ahead. The man looked up as John approached, his expression both apologetic and supportive. "Excuse me," John began, extending a hand. "I just wanted to thank you for speaking up earlier. I'm John Carter." The man shook his hand firmly. "I know who you are, Mr. Carter. I've followed your work for years. And I have to say, what happened back there was appalling." John nodded, his jaw tightening.
"It was.
"And we intend to make sure it's addressed properly. But we're going to need witnesses, people who are willing to speak out about what they saw." "You can count on me," the man said without hesitation. "That flight attendant was out of line from the moment you boarded. Everyone in this cabin saw it." John gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you. My team will be in touch once we land. Can I get your contact information?" The man quickly scribbled his details on the back of a business card and handed it over. "Happy to help in any way I can." As John moved to speak with another passenger, Angela began her own efforts. She turned to the woman seated across the aisle, who had been watching the situation unfold with a mix of discomfort and outrage. "Hi," Angela began, her voice soft but steady. "I hate to bother you, but you saw what happened, didn't you?" The woman nodded immediately. "I did. It was disgusting. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." "Thank you," Angela said, her lips curving into a small, grateful smile. "We're going to make sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug. But we'll need witnesses who are willing to speak out." The woman hesitated for only a moment before nodding again. "Of course. Count me in." By the time the plane began its descent, the Carters had gathered contact information from half a dozen passengers, all of whom were willing to testify about Cindy's behavior. Angela had also discreetly photographed Cindy several times throughout the flight, ensuring there would be no way for her to deny her actions later. But Cindy herself seemed to be unraveling. Every time she walked past the Carters' row, her face was pale and her steps were hurried. She avoided eye contact completely, as if ignoring them might erase what had happened. Angela watched her carefully, her mind racing. "She's scared," she said quietly to John.
"She should be," John replied.
Angela frowned, her gaze still fixed on Cindy. "I don't think this is the first time she's treated someone this way. She's too comfortable with it." John's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You're probably right. And if that's the case, there's a paper trail somewhere. We'll find it." When the plane finally touched down, Angela felt a wave of relief wash over her. But the fight was far from over. As the passengers began to disembark, Cindy stationed herself near the exit, her expression tense but polite as she murmured perfunctory goodbyes. When it was the Carters' turn to leave, she avoided their gaze entirely. But John stopped in front of her, forcing her to look up. "You'll be hearing from our legal team," he said quietly, his voice calm but deadly serious. Cindy opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Angela stepped past her without a second glance, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. As they exited the jet bridge, the Carters were met by a small entourage. Their chief legal counsel, Rachel, along with 2 members of their PR team. Rachel, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, wasted no time. "Are you both okay?" she asked, her tone brisk but concerned. "We're fine," Angela replied, though her voice was laced with exhaustion. Rachel nodded. "Good. We've already begun drafting a statement. The goal is to control the narrative before the airline has a chance to spin it. Do you have everything we discussed? Photos? Witness contact information?" Angela handed over her phone. "It's all here. And witnesses?"
6 so far, John said.
"They're willing to testify." "Perfect," Rachel said, her lips curving into a satisfied smile. "The airline's legal team is going to have a very bad day." Angela let out a small, bitter laugh. "Good. They deserve it." Rachel's expression softened slightly. "I know this was humiliating, but you handled it exactly right. Now, let's make sure the world knows what happened." As the Carters were escorted to their waiting car, Angela leaned back against the seat, finally allowing herself to relax slightly. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" she asked John quietly. "They won't have a choice," he replied. "Not when the world is watching." Angela nodded, her resolve hardening again. "Then let's make sure they're watching." The boardroom was silent, save for the low hum of the projector. A slideshow of photos and text scrolled across the screen, each image more damning than the last. Angela sat at the head of the table, her posture regal and composed, though her eyes burned with quiet fury. "Here," Rachel said, clicking to the next slide. "This is Cindy Roberts' personnel file, or at least what we've been able to uncover so far." On the screen was a scanned document with large red stamps. "Incident resolved. No disciplinary action taken." Angela frowned, leaning forward. "How many incidents are we talking about?" Rachel adjusted her glasses, her tone clinical but tinged with disgust. 4 official complaints over the last 3 years, all from passengers of color, each one buried under the guise of internal resolution. John, seated beside Angela, let out a low, bitter laugh. "So they've known who she is this whole time. And they did nothing." "Exactly," Rachel replied. "The airline's legal team is trying to claim these were isolated incidents, but the pattern is undeniable. Worse, we've found emails between her supervisors suggesting they were aware of her behavior, but chose to overlook it to avoid bad press." Angela's jaw tightened. "And now they're going to face the press anyway," she said sharply. Rachel gave her a small, approving smile. "Exactly. We've already secured interviews with several major networks. Once this hits the news cycle, the airline will be forced to act." John leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "What about the witnesses from the flight? Have they all agreed to speak publicly?" Rachel nodded. 5 out of 6 have confirmed. The last one is hesitant, but we're working on them." Angela exchanged a glance with John. "It's enough," she said firmly. "Between the witnesses, the photos, and Cindy's record, we have more than enough to make our case." John nodded. "Good. Let's make sure it sticks." Later that evening, Angela stood in their home office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city's skyline. The lights of Manhattan glittered in the distance, but her mind was elsewhere. She heard John enter the room behind her, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. He came to stand beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Angela sighed, her breath fogging the glass. "I was just thinking about that first flight we took together. Remember? Back when we couldn't even afford economy, let alone first class." John chuckled softly. "I remember. We were flying to pitch to our first investor. You were so nervous you could barely sit still." Angela smiled faintly. "And now here we are. Billionaires. Philanthropists. People who've supposedly made it. And yet, we still have to deal with this." She turned to face him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "What's the point of all of it, John? The money, the success. What does it matter if people still see us as less than them?" John cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "It matters because we're in a position to change things. Most people who go through what we did on that flight don't have the platform or the resources to fight back. But we do. And that's why we can't back down." Angela nodded slowly, drawing strength from his words. "You're right. We can't let this go. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been treated like this." The next day, the story broke. Every major news outlet carried the headline, "Billionaire couple faces discrimination in first class. Airline under fire for handling of incident." Video clips and photos from the flight flooded social media, along with testimonials from witnesses who had been on board. Angela's photograph of Cindy, her face twisted in anger, circulated widely, becoming a symbol of the systemic issues plaguing the airline industry. The backlash was swift. The airline issued a statement within hours calling the incident unacceptable and promising a full investigation. But it wasn't enough. Calls for boycotts spread across the internet, and the company's stock took a nosedive. In a press conference, John and Angela addressed the situation with their trademark poise. "This isn't just about one flight attendant," Angela said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about accountability, respect, and basic human decency. John stepped in, his deep voice commanding the room. We've spent our lives building businesses and creating opportunities for others. But no amount of success can shield you from prejudice. That's why we're here today, to make sure no one else has to experience what we did. Their words struck a chord. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for the Carters was trending worldwide. Behind the scenes, the airline was scrambling. Emails between Cindy's supervisors and the HR department were leaked to the press, revealing a pattern of negligence and cover-ups. A former employee came forward, claiming they had been fired after reporting similar behavior from Cindy. The CEO of the airline called a private meeting with the Carters' legal team, desperate to contain the damage. "We're prepared to offer a public apology and a substantial settlement," the CEO said, his tone carefully measured. Rachel folded her arms, unimpressed. "How substantial are we talking?" The CEO slid a folder across the table. Rachel opened it, her eyebrows lifting slightly at the number inside. But when she glanced at Angela and John, their expressions didn't waver. "Money isn't the issue," Angela said firmly. "This is about accountability. What are you doing to ensure this never happens again?" The CEO hesitated. "We're implementing mandatory diversity training for all employees." "Not enough," John interrupted. "We want transparency. Public audits of your hiring practices, your training programs, and your disciplinary procedures. And we want a seat at the table to ensure those changes are meaningful." The CEO's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. "We'll make it happen." Angela leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "And Cindy's?" "She's been terminated," the CEO said quickly. Angela didn't blink.
"Good.
"But this doesn't end with her. We'll be watching. And so will the world." That evening, as the Carters watched the sunset from their terrace, Angela felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken the first step. "Do you think it'll really change anything?" she asked John. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It already has. And it'll keep changing as long as we keep pushing." Angela smiled faintly, resting her head against his chest. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Cindy Roberts had never felt so exposed. Her face was everywhere. News outlets plastered her photo across their websites and TV screens, alongside headlines that left no room for ambiguity. "Flight attendant at center of discrimination scandal fired amid backlash." Her phone buzzed endlessly with texts, emails, and social media notifications, most of them vicious. Some were from people she knew, others from strangers. Her Instagram and Facebook accounts had been inundated with hateful comments, forcing her to deactivate them. As she sat in her small apartment, staring at the blank wall, Cindy could still hear the words of her supervisor from the meeting earlier that day. "We can't protect you, Cindy. This incident has gone beyond internal resolution. You're officially terminated, effective immediately." The words echoed in her mind like a death knell. Terminated. But that wasn't the worst of it. The investigation into her conduct had unearthed a series of complaints Cindy had convinced herself would never see the light of day. She'd always managed to skate by, blaming stress or denying the allegations outright. But now, all of it was out in the open, and there was no escaping the truth. Meanwhile, in the Carter household, Angela sat at the kitchen counter, sipping a cup of herbal tea as she scrolled through her emails. John sat across from her, typing furiously on his laptop. "Rachel just sent the latest statement draft," Angela said, glancing up at him. "She's including the findings from Cindy's personnel file." "It's damning." John nodded without looking up.
"Good.
"The more evidence we present, the harder it'll be for the airline to recover without implementing real change." Angela set her mug down, leaning back in her chair. "Do you think Cindy ever thought this would happen? That her actions would lead to something like this?" John finally looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Probably not. People like her don't think they'll ever be held accountable. They assume the system will protect them." Angela exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Well, the system did protect her. For years. That's the problem." John leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "Not anymore. not after this. As the Carters continued their efforts to push for systemic accountability, the airline's leadership scrambled to salvage their reputation. The company announced a sweeping overhaul of its policies, including mandatory diversity and inclusion training, third-party audits of its employee conduct records, and a public commitment to transparency. But it wasn't enough for the Carters. "This isn't about public relations," Angela said during a meeting with the airline's newly hired crisis management team. "This is about ensuring that no one else has to experience what we did." Words are meaningless without action. The crisis manager, a polished woman in her 50s, nodded earnestly. "We understand that, Mrs. Carter. That's why we're here, to work with you and your team to create real, measurable change." Angela's expression was unyielding. Then start by addressing the culture that allowed someone like Cindy Roberts to keep her job despite multiple complaints. How many other employees are you protecting? How many other passengers have been mistreated? The woman flinched slightly under Angela's piercing gaze but nodded. "We're already conducting a full internal review. Anyone found to have enabled or ignored discriminatory behavior will be held accountable." Angela exchanged a glance with John, who gave her a subtle nod. "Good," Angela said finally. "We'll be watching." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The Carters appeared on talk shows, participated in panel discussions, and met with advocacy groups to discuss broader issues of racial discrimination in corporate America. Their story had sparked a national conversation, and they were determined to keep the momentum going. One evening, as they prepared for a televised interview, Angela adjusted her earrings in the dressing room mirror, her reflection looking back at her with quiet determination. "Ready?" John asked, stepping into the room. Angela met his gaze in the mirror. "Always," he smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "You know, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "This whole situation started because one person thought they could treat us like we didn't belong. But now we're standing here, about to speak to millions of people, and she's probably sitting in her apartment, wondering how everything fell apart." Angela turned to face him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Justice has a way of catching up with people." John nodded. "And we're making sure it doesn't stop with her." Back at Cindy's apartment, the knock on her door startled her out of her daze. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, revealing a man in a suit holding a thick envelope. "Cindy Roberts?" he asked. "Yes," she replied warily. The man handed her the envelope. "You've been served." Her heart sank as she stared at the papers in her hands. The Carters weren't just going after the airline, they were going after her personally. She slammed the door shut, her breathing ragged. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. As the case against the airline moved forward, more stories began to surface. Former employees and passengers came forward with their own accounts of mistreatment, painting a picture of a company that had long turned a blind eye to systemic issues. The Carters used their platform to amplify these voices, ensuring that the fight for accountability extended beyond their own experience. "This isn't just about us," Angela said during a press conference. "It's about every person who's ever been silenced, every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. We're fighting for them." Her words resonated deeply, sparking renewed calls for reform across the airline industry and beyond. One afternoon, Angela received an unexpected email. It was from a former colleague of Cindy's who had left the airline years earlier. The email detailed a culture of discrimination and intimidation within the company, with Cindy allegedly acting as a ringleader. Attached were screenshots of internal messages between Cindy and other employees, filled with derogatory comments and mocking passengers. Angela forwarded the email to Rachel immediately, adding a note, "We need this for the case. It's bigger than we thought." As the lawsuit gained traction, the airline's CEO resigned, citing personal reasons. Cindy, now unemployed and ostracized, issued a public apology through her lawyer, though it was met with widespread skepticism. "I deeply regret my actions and the pain I've caused," the statement read. "I am committed to learning from this experience and becoming a better person." Angela read the apology aloud to John as they sat in their living room that evening. "What do you think?" she asked. John shrugged. "Too little, too late. She's only apologizing because she got caught." Angela nodded. Still, I hope she means it. Because if she doesn't, this will happen again with someone else. John took her hand, his expression softening. Thanks to you, the world is a little less forgiving of people like her. Angela smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. Thanks to us. Months had passed since the fateful flight, but the ripple effects of the incident were far from over. The Carters stood on the stage of a packed auditorium in New York City, the audience filled with policymakers, business leaders, and activists. Angela adjusted the microphone, glancing at John, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Good evening, she began, her voice clear and steady. When John and I boarded that flight, we never expected that a moment of humiliation would turn into a movement for change. What happened to us was unacceptable, but it wasn't unique. And that's why we're here today, to ensure that no one else has to endure what we did. The room erupted in applause, but Angela held up a hand to quiet the crowd. This isn't about us. This is about dismantling the systems that allow discrimination and prejudice to thrive. It's about creating environments where respect and dignity are non-negotiable. And it's about holding people and institutions accountable for their actions. John stepped forward, his commanding presence filling the room. We've learned that change doesn't happen by staying silent. It happens when you stand up, speak out, and refuse to back down. That's what we've done, and that's what we'll continue to do. The applause was deafening, but Angela didn't smile. Not yet. There was still so much work to be done. The airline had been forced to settle the lawsuit, agreeing to pay a multi-million-dollar sum that the Carters had immediately funneled into a new nonprofit organization, Elevate Equality, a foundation dedicated to combating systemic discrimination in the workplace. As part of the settlement, the airline also implemented sweeping reforms, including third-party oversight of its diversity and inclusion programs. Quarterly reports on employee conduct and training were made public, ensuring that the company could no longer hide behind closed doors. But for Angela and John, the victory wasn't just about the settlement or the reforms. It was about the cultural shift they had helped ignite. Across industries, companies began reevaluating their policies and practices, spurred on by the Carters' example. It's not enough to write a check or issue an apology, Angela said during an interview with a major news outlet. Real change requires action, transparency, and accountability. And we won't stop until we see it. As for Cindy, her life had taken a stark turn. She had been blacklisted from the airline industry, her reputation too tarnished for any company to take a chance on her. Job applications went unanswered, and her savings dwindled as she struggled to make ends meet. She had tried to rebuild her image, issuing apologies and even attending workshops on racial sensitivity, but the damage was done. The world had moved on, but Cindy remained trapped in the shadow of her actions, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could act with impunity. One day, Cindy sat in the back row of a community center, listening to a speaker from the Elevate Equality Foundation. The topic was systemic discrimination in the workplace, and Cindy found herself nodding along, her guilt weighing heavy on her chest. As the event ended, she lingered, watching as the attendees filed out. For the first time, Cindy wondered if it was possible to change, not just how the world saw her, but how she saw herself. Back in their Manhattan penthouse, Angela and John sat on the balcony, a bottle of wine between them. The city lights stretched out before them, a reminder of how far they had come. Angela swirled her glass thoughtfully. Do you ever think about how this all started? John raised an eyebrow. You mean Cindy? Angela nodded. Her. The flight. Everything. John leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the skyline. I think about it all the time, but not in the way you might think. Angela tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? I don't think about the slap or the humiliation, John said slowly. I think about what it led to, the lives we've touched, the changes we've made. If I had to go through it all again to get to this point, I would... Angela smiled faintly, her eyes shining. Me too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling around them. Finally, Angela spoke. Do you think we've done enough? John turned to her, his expression serious. We've done a lot. But enough? I don't think there's such a thing. Not when it comes to this. Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we keep going. John lifted his glass. To keeping going? Angela clinked her glass against his, a small smile tugging at her lips. To keeping going? The next morning, Angela sat in her home office, scrolling through the latest updates from the foundation. She paused at an email from a young woman who had attended one of their workshops. The subject line read, "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak up." Angela opened the email, her eyes scanning the heartfelt words. "Mrs. Carter, your story inspired me to report my manager for his discriminatory behavior. I was scared at first, but seeing how you and your husband stood up for yourselves gave me the strength to stand up for myself. Thank you for showing me that my voice matters." Angela's chest tightened as she finished reading, tears pricking her eyes. She forwarded the email to John with a simple message, "This is why we do it." That evening, as they prepared for another speaking engagement, Angela stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her necklace. She caught John's reflection behind her, watching her with a small smile. "What is it?" she asked, turning to face him. "Just proud of you," he said simply. Angela laughed softly, shaking her head. "Proud of us." John stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Let's go remind the world why they should be, too." As they walked onto the stage once more, the applause was deafening, a testament to the impact they had made. Angela took John's hand, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.